Hey there, everyone. It's Denise Salcedo. Welcome back to the channel. I am very excited to introduce to you my guest for today. She is TNA Wrestling's very own Dani Luna. Dani, how are you?
Hi, Denise. Thanks for having me. I'm good, thank you.
I gotta tell you, the first thing that I thought of when you hopped on was I love the green hair. How hard is it to maintain,
Oh,
though?
all of my bed sheets are ruined. Absolute mess. It's horrible. You can't have anything white. It glows in the dark though, so it has its perks, I guess.
Oh, that is so cool. That's very, very cool. Now, I really love it, man. It looks very like I know I would never be able to like maintain it, but I know that it
Uh,
looks very cool, so it's worth
it's
it.
easier than you think. I think you should try.
Okay, okay, all right. So, Danny, I gotta start off by saying that your performance at the Ultimate X match was absolutely phenomenal. You went in there, and I'm like, you just look so strong, so powerful, and you were one of the competitors in that match that just, like, really, really stood out to me. Let's start there. How'd you feel getting to compete in a match like that?
Oh, it was so cool. It was terrifying more than anything. I almost wish I fell off right at the end, and I almost wish I'd have fallen off earlier on, because at least it would have been done and it would have been out of my system. But the fear of falling off of that thing is so much worse than actually falling off of it. Um, but it was so cool. Like the amount of things you can do in a match like that. If you think of all the things you can do in a match, and then you add six other people, and then you add this huge structure that you can all hang off of, like there's just so many ways to get around it. And obviously, I was sharing it with some incredible women too. Lots of women that I'd never even wrestled before, so that was a whole thing in itself. Um, but yeah, it was crazy. It was a great time, but I reckon I'd like to do another one, but maybe not loads of them.
You're like, "I'll take it one step at a time." But
Yeah.
seriously, I thought you did phenomenal. So, getting this opportunity to sign with TNA Wrestling, how has this, sort of recoursed your career? Because I know you were previously with WWE NXT UK, and then you're very, very young. So you started very early in pro wrestling, and now you're doing TNA Wrestling. So how has that like sort of changed the course of your career, and how are you feeling?
Yeah, it's great. I think it's really kinda exactly what I needed at this point in my career. Obviously, like you said, I was in NXT UK a bit, but I was even younger when I was there. I was about 19 when I signed, so it's a lot to handle at a very young age. And then I had a year or 2 out just doing the independents, like, throughout the UK, and then coming over to Canada, and we started doing stuff with Impact at the time. Um, it really helped kind of, I think, level me up. As much as obviously I'd been in WWE and that was really cool, I don't think I was necessarily ready for that sort of stage at my age and my experience level. But it gave me so many tools that I think now I can bring to somewhere like TNA, where I'm a bit more grown up, a bit more experienced, and a lot more prepared for it. Um, so I really think it's like the perfect place for me to be right now, um, to kind of show the rest of the world what, say, here in the UK, everybody else already knows. So it's nice to be able to share it and get a bit more kind of like international notoriety, I suppose.
Definitely. How did you feel when you were offered the contract with TNA?
Oh, it was crazy. Like, obviously, we'd done a little bit with them with subculture. So it wasn't out of nowhere, but it was very much like, okay, like they understand what I'm trying to put out into the world. And I think that's the biggest thing I've got from it, is that there's a lot of trust in someone giving you a job like that. It's them going, we know that you know what you're doing and we want to help you get there. Um, so if anything, it was just such a pleasure to see that like other people knew what I wanted to do and could see the goals that I have and wanted to help me along that way. I'm very thankful that they believe in me so much.
That's like you when I was watching you in the Ultimate X match, like I kept thinking like, "Oh my gosh, he's so strong." Like I almost felt like you were getting like all of the Jordan Grace spots in that match, which kind of made you stand out like even more. And so just kind of seeing already what you've been able to do with TNA Wrestling, it's been cool because I can only imagine that you've already found this like new set of eyeballs, this new set of fans. Because like I remember doing the post show for Hard to Kill, and everybody was like, "Oh, Danny Luna, Danny Luna, Danny Luna," and I'm like, "That's very freaking cool."
Yeah, it is cool. I guess that match was especially it being the first TNA pay-per-view. in a long time. There was a lot of eyes on that show, and obviously the first match on the show. So it did really kind of throw me into the deep end a little bit of so many people that might not have even been watching TNA at the time had tuned in because this was the first pay-per-view back, and then I'm one of the first people they see, and they might not have even ever heard of me. So it was a really nice way, I think, and a really good showcase for me to kind of show what I'm all about in like a really exciting way, as opposed to just being, brought on TV, which would have been great, but it was so exciting to do it, in Vegas on live pay-per-view. Like there was so many cool things about it.
No, that's so awesome, man. I was so excited, like just getting to see you do all of that stuff. I was like, I just wanted to like know more about you. And I feel like that's how a lot of the viewers that were watching you kind of felt. So I do want to rewind a little bit here because we're talking about how young you are and how early you started in pro wrestling. I believe you said 19 years old, and that's not even including that was like your official debut, right? That wasn't even when you started training, correct?
Yeah, that was WWE. So
Yeah.
I was 16 when I first started training. Um, I think it's a lot more common here in the UK to start so young. Whenever I talk to Americans, they're always a bit shocked by it, but most of the people that wrestle in the UK have been doing it since they were very young. Um, but yeah, I started in a little town called Gloucester, which is where my parents lived. And then I found my school in Cardiff, where I live now in Wales, called New Wave Wrestling, and I kind of like grew into myself there. But obviously, it's a very little country, so we have to do a lot of kind of, if I could get big here, I can move across and I can get big somewhere else. And it just kind of snowballed very quickly into obviously NXT UK, and then here. Like, I feel like it's all happens really fast, and I have to kind of stop myself and be grateful and take it all in sometimes.
So that's the thing. So you were 16 years old, and then very quickly, within 3 years, you go off to NXT UK. And then, like you mentioned, now you are getting very featured on TNA Wrestling. So when you think back to 16-year-old you, when you first started wrestling school, uh, what was that like? What was that experience? And like, why did you decide to pursue this? Because and like I'm always blown away, especially like even growing up a female wrestling fan. It's one thing I feel like to be a female wrestling fan, but then to go and pursue a wrestling career as a female, it's very, very awesome. And like I applaud all of the girls that were like, especially very young, that went off and did that. So kind of tell us about how you got started into actually choosing to pursue this as a career.
Yeah, so I actually got interested quite late, I guess, as a kid. I think I was only maybe 14 when I first started watching it. So the turnaround between me watching it and deciding I wanted to do it was pretty small. Um, But my older brother was, like, obsessed with wrestling. He's 10 years older than me, and he'd always kinda stay up and watch the pay-per-views. And I remember one day I was just off school, sorry, sick, and I was in the living room just sleeping, and he came down and he's like, "Oh, can I watch the wrestling?" Because obviously it's on at, like, 3 a.m. here in the UK. Um, so he came down and asked to watch it, and I was like, "Yeah, sure, I don't care." And I think it was like an elimination chamber, um, but I remember just seeing it and then being glued, and from that day, I literally stayed up with him every Monday night before school on the Tuesday and watched it with him. Um, and then I don't know, that very quickly became me just Googling wrestling school. Um, and I literally went to the first one that came up. There happened to be one about 10 minutes from my house, which was very lucky. Um, but yeah, I just kinda it was one of those things that it's such a strange thing to go and do that I didn't really feel like I could prepare too much for it. The only thing I really knew what to do was to go to the gym. So that's how I ended up being really strong because I was like, well, wrestlers are strong. So that's just what I did first. And then, yeah, I just kind of turned up. And obviously, being so young, it was quite intimidating, but is quickly alleviated by the fact that there was so many more young people there than old people. Like, I guess there was just an influx of people of sort of my generation that kind of realized, oh, we can just start, we can just do this. And even if you don't do shows for a few years, at least you're getting your feet in there. Um, so yeah, it's a pretty weird place to grow up, I guess, to kind of become an adult around wrestling is always interesting. But it's always been very good to me, and I've never had any bad times growing up for it.
It's funny because I was gonna ask you how you got so strong, but it's so funny you were like, "I just went to the gym because that's what a wrestler does."
Yeah, I know.
It's very
That
brilliant,
was option for
actually.
me.
Yeah, because I'm watching it and I'm like, "How the hell is she so freaking strong?" And, like, that is but it's a skill, it's a talent. For you, what would you say was, like, the easiest part for you and, like, the most challenging part?
I think I struggled a lot with the confidence of talking for a long time. I think that comes from being so young too, is that you're not really used to talking in front of anyone, let alone like a whole stadium full of people. Um, so that took a little while to get used to. I always found the physicality of wrestling really easy. Um, and I think that came mostly from going to the gym for a bit before I started. And I watched so much wrestling, so I kind of like understood the idea of it, of how it would work. Um, but from there, I just kind of found like I could wrestle really well, but I couldn't necessarily talk very well. So it took a few years for me to like find something that I was passionate about, that I could talk about passionately, and that made it a lot easier. And for the most part, it's usually just wrestling, and I can find if I can talk about that for hours, I can probably talk about anything for hours as long as I approach it with the same sort of enthusiasm. But that was definitely the hardest thing for me, and, like, now I'm super confident with it, and it doesn't bother me at all, but I've just kinda had to force myself to be really uncomfortable in order to make it work, you know?
Oh yeah, I 100% get it. Like in acting classes, they make you like do like all these really weird things and it's all just to make you uncomfortable so that you can get used to it and be comfortable in speaking situations and things like that. So that's very freaking cool. So okay, so you're 14, you go to wrestling school, 16, you're wrestling already having your matches, 19, you go off, you start your career. Did you quit school? Did you continue school? Like what was the I don't know, like, how did your parents feel about when it came to your schoolwork?
So I originally lied to my parents. I told them I was going to like a gymnastics class because I thought that was a bit more palatable. Um, and they were cool with that. And then I just slowly kind of was like, "Yeah, it's wrestling school." Um, but they didn't really care. They've never really been that bothered. They were just happy that I was doing something that I enjoyed. Um, but yeah, so I was in school a lot of the time that I was training, and then a little bit while I was wrestling, but I wasn't wrestling that regularly, when I started, it was a bit more kinda as and when. Um, but then by the time I left school, I got a job in like a what do you call it? I got it in like a doctor's surgery. It was just like a secretary. But it meant I only worked like Monday to Friday, so I always had the weekends off. So I just wrestle on the weekends. And from the time I was about 16, that's just what I did. Like I worked full time and then I wrestled on the weekend and then I went back to work on the Monday. And I kind of did that for 8 years until I'm kind of where I am now. So it was a lot at points, but it was kind of okay because wrestling never felt like work. People would always say to me at work, like, "Oh, well, you technically have 2 jobs." And I'm like, "Yeah, but it doesn't feel like it. If I could do this one all the time, I'd feel like I had no job at all." Um, so it's great, but it was a lot and it's a very, like, tiring time, but I think that's where you decide how much you really want something because it was never an option to not do it. It was never an option to not go to the gym because it was all things that would better me to become a better wrestler, and that's what I wanted to be. So it never felt like too much of a struggle.
Well, they always say, like, find something that you love because then it doesn't feel like you're actually going to work. So I
Mhm.
feel like you did just that, which is really great because especially when you find what you want to do at such a young age, like to me, like that's a blessing because, sometimes you can take a little bit of a longer time to figure out what it is that you want to do. So, Danny, when you think of your pro wrestling career, especially because, you still have such a bright future ahead of you, who are some of your inspirations that when you look at those people, you're like, man, I hope that I get to have a career similar to that person, or I just really love this person's in ring style. Who are some of those people that you gravitate towards in pro wrestling?
I guess it kinda differentiates between eras, I suppose. As a kid, my favorite wrestler was Mark Henry, um, which I'm still waiting to tell him that because I think it's very cute.
I was like, have you got
It
a
was a
chance to meet him yet?
No, I was meant to do, Busted Open with him and Tommy last week, but he couldn't get on the show. He had, like, travel issues or something, and I really wanted to tell him the story because he was the first wrestler I ever seen. That Elimination Chamber I watched, Mark Henry was in it, and I was like, "That's my guy."
Oh my God, that is
Um,
so cool. That is so cool.
but I'll tell him one day. Um So I guess I always kind of gravitated towards like the stronger wrestlers. Um, I think like I was a bit of a chubbier kid when I was growing up, so I don't know if that just kind of attracted itself to me more. It felt more kind of like something I could do. Um, but then on the other end of the spectrum, I was really big into Ring of Honor when that was kind of in its peak because that was like elite independent wrestling. So you have your like your El Genericos, your sorry, your Nigel McGuinness's, like all these incredible athletes that were so like hard hitting, and I felt like they gave me the most genuine wrestling that I could watch, kind of online from my bedroom. Um, so I had a lot of inspiration from them as well. Um, and then like obviously I've come to TNA and Jordan Grace is at the very top of the mountain. And it's hard not to, compare us, and it's fine. And I love it. It's a great person to be compared to.
Yeah.
Um, but seeing all that she's done, especially recently, she's really kind of completely reinvented what someone in TNA can do. She's gone out, she's done the Royal Rumble. Like, that's insane. Like, it's such a cool thing to do. So I'd be lying if I said I didn't look up to her. I think she's such a good example of a strength wrestler and a power wrestler, but then she's flipped that on her head and she's been a bodybuilder and she's been the leanest person on the roster and she's kind of done everything. Um, and I always think that's really inspirational that she's kind of taken all these stereotypes that people have given her and just turned them completely around. Um, I think that'd be great. I'd really like to wrestle her again in TNA. We did one on the UK tour, and I'd really like to do it again.
I feel like just given like that was like the first thing I told you was making that Jordan Grace comparison. Like you said, not a bad thing because now you have an idea of these possibilities and things that can happen. But just based off of that, I do think that you and Jordan Grace, having some sort of feud together or anything like that would be really freaking awesome. And I'm sure the fans would definitely want to see it. So I got two more questions for you before we wrap up. And I guess the first one is, I'm curious, like, who is Dani Luna outside of pro wrestling? Like, what are things I know you had mentioned that when it came to the talking, as long as you talked about stuff that you were passionate about outside of wrestling, like, what are some of your interests?
Um, it's hard because it kind of is wrestling, but I'm obviously very much into the gym. Um, I did get into that through wrestling, but I've made a very good effort to like separate the two. So that's a completely like different love of mine. Um, I'm really big into music as well. A lot of I find like my characteristics in wrestling come from a lot of music inspirations I had. So I was really big into like the California punk rock scene. So like bands like the Descendants and stuff were really kind of like the first music I found growing up that was different. And I really resonated with that in a very similar way that I resonated with pro wrestling. And even when me and the boys were putting like subculture together, that was always kind of our common thing. We were like, what are these different subcultures of music in the same way that pro wrestling is a subculture to the rest of sport, like how we kind of found our little cliques within these big groups that were falling down into the smaller categories. Um, so yeah, I find a lot of my kind of bonds with other wrestlers are over music. I think the being a musician and being a pro wrestler are very similar careers in the same way that you kind of just have to get your head down and deal with all the tiny horrible shows where you don't get a bathroom and you'll get changed in the same room and then but the love for it just kind of keeps you going. So I think you can feel that in music, and I think you can feel it in pro wrestling.
I think you're right on that, by the way. Like the second you mentioned, like performing at small venues, making your way up, it is very, very similar. My last question to you is, we just started 2024, and I always ask people like what their goals are. And so I'm going to ask you that, like, you're getting started with TNA. You just officially signed with them in December, so it's only been a bit, and so there's a lot of new things happening with TNA. There's a lot, there's the rebrand, there's new faces coming in, all of that for you, like, what's the bucket list item for this year or things that you wanna make sure that you accomplish?
So my main one for this year, me and Jody Threat have just started being a little team. Um, I think our goal for 2024 is to win the Knockouts Tag Team Championships. And I don't think that's completely out of left field. I think it's absolutely something we could do. I think we're starting to build a really good tag division in TNA now. And I'd love to get up there on a bigger stage with her. She's one of my favorite people in the world. So I would love to kind of hold gold with her in TNA this year. I think that would be the best.
Another powerhouse. I love that. So
Yeah.
it's like the duo
We
of the
attract
powerhouse. Yeah, I was gonna say that's a very, very cool tag team. Oh my gosh. Well, Danny, before we wrap things up, please let the people know where they can follow you, where they can check out your work, where they can watch TNA wrestling, all of that good stuff.
Okay, well, I am on at Dani Luna underscore pro on pretty much everything. You can find me on there. Obviously, you can watch TNA weekly on the TNA Plus app, which is very brand new and very, very functional. It's big over here because in the UK, because we don't have all your fancy American TV channels. Um, we've obviously got our New Orleans shows coming up. We have pay per view, and then we have Body Blaster tapings the next day, hoping to be a big part of them as well. Um, and yeah, hopefully more Dani Luna on your screens for the rest of the year. Um, Only good things.
I think so too. You're killing it so far, Danny. I can't wait to continue seeing what you're going to be doing in TNA wrestling. As for everybody watching, of course, all of the links to that, everything that Danny mentioned will be in the description box below. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll catch you guys on the next one. Bye, everyone.